Welcome to Liberate 2021. We are so excited you are here. I'm Monica Kang. I have Aiden here, and I'm super excited because one of the things, if you're like me, is any event, any workshop I join, is just being really excited to realize, hey, what's about to happen? What are we actually talking about? And who else is going to be here? What are they thinking about? And so I'm really excited because one of the things for this event that we were particular is really asking all the participants a set of questions at the beginning, not only to get your insights on these key topics of what you think about accessibility, but really giving our chance to see what are you all thinking about to design something. And thank God we have somebody in the team like Aiden who actually has the lens to analyze what you've shared to find patterns. So Aiden, so glad you're here. Really can't wait to dig a little bit deeper. Tell us a little bit more what process you took to really study and what are some maybe key highlights that came up.
Thanks, Monica. First of all, I am a qualitative researcher, so this is what I really like to get into. And the survey that we set it up to get as much information, knowledge, perspectives from participants before they came, and there were over 100 respondents, and I was able to dig into them. And basically, what it involves is taking all the survey results and sitting down with them and reading through them and looking for relevant themes or ideas that begin to emerge across the responses. And this workshop is drawing people from a wide range of backgrounds. So finding common themes can be difficult, but they're there. So that was the broader sense of how do you bring these together? How do you begin to develop themes or ideas? And how do you then begin to go back through them and refine those ideas?
So how do you do it? What process does it take?
Well, I use a software, assistive technology called NVivo, and that actually is a program that allows me to go through and to begin to highlight and code things. And so if I see something where someone's talking about something, I can then go back and say, oh, the person's talking about users, end users, the person's talking about this barrier, the person's talking about insurance, the person's talking about caregivers. And I begin to develop these categories, and it begins to basically put them inside of those. So then you can see as you go through them, what are people talking about the most? And then to go back in there and then to refine those further. And so it takes multiple passes, and I can tell you it's probably the most time-consuming aspect of qualitative research. For those who've done it, there's a lot of people who have, but it's worthwhile because things begin to bubble up from across what looks like, I guess you could say, no patterns. They're there. It's something that is difficult, but if you just keep looking, you'll find it.
That's so helpful. Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, very interesting. I mean, one of the things that even for me, as I was looking back at the questions, we were asking participants from your experience, what is already working well? Where do you see your field heading? How do you feel about the direction? Where should we be going? What should we be doing more or less? What do you hope to get out of the event? Liberate 2021. What do you wish others understood better about you, your work, experience, and perspective? And anything else? These are all questions that we asked. And for me, even just reading and processing, there were a lot of great insights. And Aiden, I feel for you, you're probably able to see the patterns from these messages that you're seeing with the 100+ survey results. Tell me a little bit more. Is there any 2 or 3 that really stood out to you that you'll love for us to keep in mind?
Absolutely. The first pattern that really stood out above all others was user focus. This word around what does it mean? What is the end user? And it was really interesting because the word user in itself was a pattern. How do we understand the user perspective? Words like usability, useful, usable, human to use, and inclusive design. So there was really a sense from all aspects, from both what I'd call the user side and from the research academic side. How do we incorporate the user in the entire process of assistive technologies from the beginning? And that was a big pattern that came up. And the question came from both sides, that there seems to be, it's difficult and the word end, I think, is really relevant here because the word end user gets used. And how do we think about the user not being at the end of this, but being more incorporated and more organic part of the process? The second was there was a very large focus on inclusion. And this was across multiple, I'll call them axes. So the first one is including people with disabilities in the process of research and design from the get-go. There was also how do we then within the disability community include marginalized communities? So how do we not essentialize a disability among that? And also, how do we include different ways that people experience this and not just centralize any one disability? There were other around inclusion was the sense, how do we include persons with disability in leadership positions, in funding positions, and also in the research and design? And yes, as I said, in funding. So inclusion was a big one, and I think it goes across different axes, and I think it's important that this is a big concern. The third lens was the sense that from across the 100 surveys and the group, there was a sense that one of the barriers to this, to really advancing this technology, are what I call the silos. So the kind of things that kind of make it difficult for their innovation to be made. So questions around funding were huge. Where are the incentives? What are we funding? What are insurance companies doing from that end? How are they skewing the incentive system? Ableism, the concept of ableism came up again and again, how ableism is a barrier to actually moving forward. And I think that's an important aspect for us to be looking at. Tech policy, the technology without policy doesn't go anywhere. So we can come up with some wonderful ideas and fixes, but they won't actually be impactful. It won't be game changers unless there's policy built around them. Some of the other barriers were social, but there's still a lot of stigma and bias, and finding ways to address that along with the assistive technologies would be important. I think that's about it.
No, thank you for giving us a summary insight for all of us to keep that into perspective as we're coming together. I'm curious from the macro lens and maybe micro lens for you as you're studying and qualitatively really studying these patterns, what surprised you and stood out to you the most, and why?
I would say the thing that stood out to me the most, and people and the participants definitely talked about this, were the people that I came to identify as the spanners, or the people that span different, what we call categories, persons who are researchers and are persons with disabilities, and that these people are pretty important in terms of being able to overcome or to see around these barriers, because it seems like they're the people where I think change can be made. So there's a lot of people at this workshop that span different categories that are actually sometimes become barriers. And I think that I at least got a sense that we assume a pipeline of how things work, from research and design to down to the end user. And I think that in itself is something that people were really challenging, but because some of them actually span it. Some people are researchers, some people are end users. And I think those people are pivotal in terms of finding ways forward.
That's really huge. And what a beautiful reminder that we absolutely have to make note of all the different lens and perspective. And I'm curious also, what's a lens that maybe surprised you that we didn't talk about, or that, made you curious as you're looking into all of this?
One thing that I really thought about a lot was that I came in thinking that we were going to be looking at what technology, and I thought hardware. But what I'm seeing, the lens that I found interesting, and I think there's a disability studies group here, and there's other people who are really pushing us to think really hard about what do we mean by assistive technology, and what do we need assistance in to move this forward. And then that technology may not be something that's very easily, it's not going to be like for an end user, it may be for the larger landscape. So that's one thing I found interesting, is I thought in some ways we were going to come and say, what little piece of technology are we going to push forward in robotics or AI? But a lot of people pushed at, we need to create technologies that assist us in changing this landscape so that we can actually connect end users with the people on this end. And that's something technology could do too. So there's a lot of great ideas, and people talked a lot about the difficulty in translating them to usable and impactful products. And so people said, well, we can spend a lot of money building this, but if it's not going to be used, what are we doing? So I found that really interesting, that the problem isn't necessarily in more what I'd say high-end technology. Sometimes it's finding ways to connect these groups so that this technology can be impactful from the get-go.
I love that reminder. And it goes back to some of the conversation I had, even in some of the interviews and surveys that I was reading, where they emphasize that, hey, Monica, as an example, is just thinking about the keyboard. I know, for other folks, having a clean keyboard is a nice thing. For others, it's a distraction because now we can't find the keys. We can't click and know what that key means to know what I'm trying to type. And that's a distraction that makes us inaccessible to use that tool that for somebody else it looks design friendly because it looks sleek. And I think what you're highlighting really is that, don't just think about the expensive one, think about all the expenses that build up in the user experience. And hence it seems like no surprise why the word end user, the people who are using it, to be able to invite them earlier in the design process is so crucial indeed. And I know, Aiden, at least in our team conversations, one thing that you brought up was the reminder how this whole project and workshop that we're doing together has been a humbling reminder. What any insight that came to surface that you want to share back as a participant? Because I think one example is I think we're learning real time of how it is hard, or not hard, but the correct word I would say is, how it requires extra thoughtful intentionality to really make sure it is as inclusive for all person of disability as much as we can think online. And while it has made it accessible, there are still many areas that make it feel very a barrier for some groups to be able to join. And I'm curious, it's making me think of like, why doesn't any tech tool have this all embedded so that way any user doesn't has to like think about needing to spend more resources and making it preventable for anyone to not join. But I'm curious what something else that stands out for you.
That's a great point. I mean, I think just in the creation of this workshop between the team behind the scenes, there's been a lot of work around how do we make this as inclusive as possible, and learning that as we go. I mean, and having people willing to teach us and reaching out to participants in particular. Thank you for those who've been take the time to say, did you think about this? Did you think about that? And I have to say this because one thing that I think that multiple people mentioned was, how do we make the norm all abilities? How do we create, so how would this platform work so that it didn't need to be something that was built where we had to find ways. So we don't want to make it, we don't want to build disabilities into it, or we don't want to disable people by not having a platform that is open. And that work I think is fascinating. And the other thing is, I think in terms of diversity, how do we make sure, and we've talked about this behind the scenes, how do we make sure everyone's here? Everyone who needs to be is at the table and included. And I think that's another aspect that I think, it's not ironic, but it's that participants raise that question again and again and again. And here we experience it as we put this workshop together. And I think that's been a really powerful lesson for us as we have tried to go forward. And what's great is we have the people at the workshop with the expertise to teach us how to think about bringing this all together. So I think that's an important point.
Absolutely. And this is where I really appreciated many, in fact, not only just saying the end user, but thinking about the universal design element that many of you have brought up. And I hope that if you haven't been sure, I guess this is a reminder for us to share back to you the invitation of let us know if there's things still along the way in the workshop journey and what we design and what we do together. If you feel like, hey, Monica, Aiden, I think there's an aspect that could you include this, or this part is, not as accessible, please forgive us first, I hope, but let us know how we can make it easier, because we are only going to get better by learning from all of you. And first, again, thank you for, not only calling us out, letting us know to, how we can make this better and how we can communicate this to a greater audience so that we could all learn and build upon. And so any final words, Aiden, that you want us to keep in mind as we walk into, especially day one?
All I can say is that looking over the surveys and the amount of expertise and experience in the room, so to speak, in this workshop is stunning. And I think that with the attitude of wanting to really learn and share, the outcomes are going to be amazing. So I really look forward to learning with and from all of you.
And I would also like to add, I am looking forward to learning and unlearning, because I think all of us are probably going to come from one lens or another. And who am I to say that that is the full picture? we have some parts of all the pictures, but we don't until we all come together. And so thank you very much, Aiden, for this chat and having a chance to boil this down. Again, for all participants, we're so glad you're here at Liberate 2021 and look forward to hearing your questions and comments. So please let us know. We'll put the email and where you can join, and we will see you soon again. Thank you.